Good evening, church. Brian asked me to speak this evening, and he told me that he wanted the theme for this month for our Wednesday evening, for our Sunday evening lessons to be about having a growing faith, a faith that is growing, and what we can do to do such a thing. And so naturally, I picked my favorite Bible character who refuses to grow his faith to talk about this evening. This is one of my favorite stories in all of Scripture, probably my favorite book of the Bible to look at, to study, to read over and over again. It's the book of Jonah, the minor prophet there between Obadiah and Micah. It's an exciting story, a different one, a strange one in a lot of ways, the way that it's told, the way that it's written. And so tonight we're going to walk through this book to get a full picture of who Jonah is, what he was about, what God called him to do, and what he showed about his faith in all of that. So if you haven't already, be turning to the book of Jonah. Once again, that's between Obadiah and Micah in the minor prophets. Jonah had what many in his time would have considered a great faith, an amazing faith. He was a leader. He was a prophet to his people. He was someone that God deemed worthy to speak to directly, which is a special place. It's something interesting, but as we'll see, he had faith for all of the wrong reasons. Everything that Jonah shows is showing us that his faith, even though it was meant to be pointed at God, was not in God at all. And as we begin to grow our faith, I think it's important for us to start here where Jonah begins for us. Starting in Jonah chapter 1, I'll read the first few verses here. It says, "Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah the son of Amittai, saying, 'Arise and go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me.' But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it, to go with them to Tarshish away from the presence of the Lord." Now there's several significant things just in these first few verses. The language isn't all as plain as we read it here in English. Firstly, this call narrative is very strange. If you know anything about call narratives, I suppose if you look at different call narratives of prophets, of people of God, like Isaiah, God comes to Isaiah, and Isaiah has this great vision. He looks into heaven. He sees God in his throne room. He sees the seraphim with the wings and the fire and all of this amazing stuff. And the Godhead is having a conversation amongst itself, saying, "Who will go before us to the people to speak to them?" And Isaiah happening to see all of this, even though there are these angels, these people whose name, these beings whose name is literally messenger. Despite seeing all of this, Isaiah says, "Well, God, I'll go. I'm here. I'm seeing this, and it must be for a reason." And after having a conversation with God about coming from an unclean people, having an unclean mouth, and then being cleansed, Isaiah goes, and he does. Moses, when God calls him to do all of the amazing things and works that Moses did for the sake of God and his people, when he is called, they have a bit of a back and forth. Moses is very reluctant, but they still have this long conversation that lasts several chapters. And even though he's reluctant at first, we can see how Moses came to overcome all of those things throughout his life, throughout his work for God and leading his people. He overcomes all of the things that he's reluctant about there at the beginning when God calls him. And Moses becomes this great character. But Jonah is entirely different, incredibly unique. God calls Jonah. He comes to him. He gives him this call, arise and go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it. Now, some history here, Nineveh being the capital of the enemy of Israel at the time. These are people that are constantly going to battle, doing horrific things. They don't believe in God or love him. They are against God's people. They're horrible. They're the enemy. These people, in the eyes of someone like Jonah, one of the religious elite of Israel, these people go around kicking puppies for fun in their mind. This is the idea here. We don't like them. We don't care for them. They are poor people with horrible morals. And God sees this. And so he goes to send someone. But we don't have a single word from Jonah. There's no back and forth like with Moses. There's no understanding that he's hearing this for a reason like with Isaiah. Doesn't say a word to God that we know of, at least. Jonah gets up and runs in the opposite direction. He goes down to the nearest port, and he gets on the nearest boat to Tarshish. Scholars have debated where Tarshish is, maybe somewhere around Spain or something like that. The geography is not what matters about Tarshish. It's the idea that this is like a perfect place. It's like going on a beach vacation to somewhere exotic in Europe and that kind of thing. He's getting away. He's going to the opposite end of the world from where God has called him. Not even daring to answer God from what he's been called to do. I'd rather go be somewhere comfortable than go and face my enemy directly. And in this response to the call, we see everything that we'll continue to see about Jonah's character. I would much rather go somewhere that is way more comfortable for me. That'll be nice and relaxing, God. If I'm going to go somewhere, why can't it be somewhere like Tarshish, God? And then finally, before we continue on, we have this language of the presence of the Lord that he fled from. At least that's what it says in the ESV. You might have something slightly different, but the idea of this language in the Hebrew, very literally translated, is from the face of the Lord. That Jonah was in the face, or in God's face. And the idea in the Hebrew, when you say that, is that there's this closeness to be near the face of someone, to face them. To be face to face is kind of the idea. Jonah does not want to be close to God if that's what it means to be close to him. That is the idea. More than just Jonah went away from the presence of God, he went away from what it means to be close to God if that's what it means. God, if that's what you're calling me to do, I don't know if that's what I can do. I don't know if I want to be close to a God like that. They're the enemy God. Why would I go there? So continuing on, it says, "But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God. They hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship and had lain down and was fast asleep. So the captain came and said to him, 'What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise and call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give thought to us that we may not perish.' And it goes on, and Jonah calls out to his God. He explains to them that he serves the one true living God, the one who created the land and the sea and the storm. And he tells them he's fleeing from this God, from his presence, from who he is, from what he's been called to do. And they're all deeply afraid. They cast lots. They pick straws to see whose the fault it is. And they're like, well, he must be right. Jonah draws the short straw. And Jonah tells them, maybe if you throw me overboard, you might be saved from all of this. This is my fault. I'm sorry. He didn't want to drag other people into this. He just wanted to get away himself. So they do They toss him overboard. And then afterward, there's something interesting here. Starting in verse 14, it says, "Therefore they called out to the Lord, O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you." So they picked up Jonah, hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. This situation is crazy if you think about it. Jonah causes this storm to come upon these men. They're about to be shipwrecked, probably drowning at sea. From this, after they hurl Jonah over, they understand that this is a God who does something. They understand that this God is different. They all called out to their gods. Nothing happened. They call out to this one. They do as he says. Something happens immediately. They begin to believe him. They make vows. They make promises as though they were swearing to follow him. They make sacrifices to him immediately. Despite Jonah, God is immediately working in all of those around him. Despite Jonah's reluctance, he is doing what God has called him to do, even if he's not where he was supposed to go. God is still working through him. And then, as you know, he gets swallowed by a great fish or a whale. Scholars have debated about whether it was a fish or a whale for centuries. And in all my study, I've come to decide that it doesn't matter. So Jonah, inside this whale, he says this long prayer. Often this is called as being very devout, and we're supposed to see some sort of turning point here. I beg to differ just a little bit. While he does seem like he wants to draw closer to God, that he's thankful to God for saving him, all the while, if you look at the language, he really just wants to go back to Israel. He's happy that God has saved him so that he can go back home and keep doing and being the person that he wants to be. The perfect Israelite in Israel, in his home, in the Holy Land. Even though all of these crazy things have happened to him up to this point, even though he's being preserved by some giant fish at the bottom of the sea, Jonah still hasn't completely gotten it yet. Jonah's perspective is still just a little bit twisted. Jonah's still facing the wrong direction. He's still facing home, where he'd be comfortable, not where God has called him. And after this, it says the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah up on dry land. And that was enough to convince Jonah, after a few days of sitting in that belly, to at least go and attempt to do what God has called him to do. So he gets up when the voice of the Lord comes to him, saying, "Once again, arise and go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it the message that I tell you." And continuing on there in chapter 3, it says, "So Jonah arose and went to Nineveh, according to the word of the Lord. Now Nineveh was an exceedingly great city, 3 days' journey in breadth. Jonah began to go into the city, going a day's journey. And he called out, 'Yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown.' And the people of Nineveh believed God. They called for a fast and put on sackcloth, from the greatest of them to the least of them." I am jealous of Jonah. As a minister, as a preacher, as someone who devotes a lot of time during the week to study things and work on the things that I'm going to say, so that when I come and I say things in front of these kids, usually I'm not saying something ridiculous. I'm saying something that they can take away from, that might hopefully impact them and change them and cause them to want to grow. Jonah doesn't care so much about all of that. Jonah doesn't care for these people. Jonah goes and does the bare minimum to do exactly what God has told him, so he'll stop throwing giant fish at him to get in his way. So Jonah arises, he goes into this exceedingly great city. It's one that it would take you 3 days to walk through it. He goes about a day in. So he barely gets into this city. Not very far. There's still 2/3 of it left in front of him. He probably walks into the middle of some crowded street where everybody's going about their own business and doing their own thing, being a part of a busy city life. Thousands and thousands of people. And one man, he probably doesn't get up on a box or anything. He's probably not got a megaphone to scream out to these people. Probably even just barely under his breath. Jonah says, "You have 40 days and Nineveh will be overturned." And then he goes about his way. But somebody heard that. Somebody understood that. And then eventually everybody in this ridiculously large city hears what Jonah has to say. And Nineveh believed God. And they called for a fast and put on sackcloth from the greatest to the least of them. It'll come to a point where they're even putting this on the animals. This is the idea that nobody is going to eat. That we might separate ourselves from the things that we desire, that we might draw closer to this God because we've obviously upset him. We don't want to be overturned if that's what it takes. It becomes a royal decree by the king that everyone must follow it. Everyone from the greatest to the least. No one is missed. Everyone has turned. Despite Jonah's best effort to do the bare minimum and hope that nobody gets so excited. Jonah becomes the most successful preacher of all time, batting 1,000. 1,000 being an entire city-state, the capital of the largest empire at the time, most likely. Most preachers that I know would be ecstatic. They would be more than a little bit excited. They would be bursting with joy and passion. They would be uplifted by this. What more could you want? As someone who's trying to further God in the world. But not Jonah. Beginning in chapter 4, it says, "But it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he was angry. And he prayed to the Lord and said, 'O Lord, is not this what I said when I was yet in my country? That is why I made haste to flee to Tarshish, for I knew that you are a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, and relenting from disaster. Therefore now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live.' And the Lord said, 'Do you do well to be angry?'" Jonah is angry enough to die. How about this? Some people argue that this book is written somewhat as satire, not to demerit any of the truth from it, or that any of it is not real, but that in the telling of this story, you're supposed to smile a little bit at the ridiculousness of every situation. It's hard not to. Jonah finally answers God. Jonah finally speaks a word to him that isn't a prayer from the belly of a fish. He finally answers the call from the beginning. This is it. This is why I did it, God. Because I knew you. I know who you are. I've read my scripture, God. I've heard the stories. I remember when you wanted to wipe out Israel and Moses convinced you not to because he reminded you that they were your people, that these were the people you made a promise to. I remember when you made that promise to Abraham that you would make him great, that you passed through the sacrifice in his place, saying that you would die for Abraham and all of his descendants' life. I remember that, God. I know who you are. I know that you want to save people. I know that you want to be merciful to him, and that's what your life is pointed toward. I know that that's what you've called me to do, and I don't want that for these people. They're horrible. Don't you know what they've done? Don't you know who they are, God? So just kill me now. Just end it all. I'm done. I did what you asked. And then we get a fun object lesson with a plant. God causes it to grow up over Jonah. He's sitting there watching over Nineveh from the wilderness, waiting for God to change his mind and destroy it anyway, because that's what Jonah believes that they deserve. The plant comes up and he gives him shade, and he loves the plant. It's pretty handy. Then God causes the plant to die, to shrivel up. And Jonah's angry again. Angry enough to die again over a plant. And God asks him this question again, starting in verse 9. But God said to Jonah, "Do you do well to be angry for the plant?" And he said, "Yes, I do well to be angry, angry enough to die." And the Lord said, "You pity the plant for which you did not labor, nor did you make it grow, which came into being in a night and perished in a night. Should not I pity Nineveh, that great city, in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from their left, and so much cattle?" It's a fun ending to a book. And so much cattle. It's left open-ended. Jonah doesn't answer. God doesn't continue and answer his own question. Just this open-ended question for the reader. Do you do well to be angry? Jonah didn't do anything to make the plant happen. He didn't do anything to make the Ninevites come into being. God created them. They're children of God despite what they came to do, despite the culture that they were raised in, the world that taught them to go and fight and hate these people and do abhorrent things to them. They're still God's creation. As we bring this to a close, thinking about what it means to have a growing faith, the first thing that we have to do if I want my faith to grow is get myself out of the way. Jonah had faith according to the standards of the time in Israel. I'm sure he was a very devout man, a very religious Hebrew, a great prophet of God. He cared about the Hebrews. He cared about Israel. And he wanted justice for them. He wanted to see justice done on the people that had hurt them so many times. And I think it would be easy, were we in his shoes, to say we can understand that feeling. All of this story is funny and interesting to look at until we put ourselves in Jonah's shoes. Realize that there are places that are uncomfortable for me to go and further God's will. There are people that I don't want to talk to, that it would be difficult for me to do that. They're not like me. They're from a different place than me. They come from a different culture, a different context. They believe different things. I've seen horrible things happen, and they were there. And that's hard. But if I know who God is, And if I want my faith to grow in him, then I have to get rid of all of that uncomfortableness. I have to overcome myself. To understand that God is full of grace and mercy. He's relenting from disaster. He doesn't want any of his creation to be destroyed. He's not a God who simply judges his creation by destroying it when evil is done, but he reaches out to it every time. That there might be a chance that it'll still turn to him. If I want my faith to grow, I have to understand that and get myself out of the way. To go where God calls me, even if that's uncomfortable. Even if that might be extremely difficult. That's my challenge for you this evening. If you have any needs of the church, or if you need prayers or to be baptized, would you please come forward now as we stand and as we sing?